would cause them to mute. Okay, so PFAS provisions. Okay, we're going to start fresh here. They're going to hear us. They're going to hear us. They're going to see the slides. We're going to move through the slides. I'm going to move through the slides, and we're going to talk about our favorite topic, which is PFAS. Which we did turn our attention to the PFAS in the fall with the promise that one, we would still continue working on the other regs, and two, we'd actually get these regs out by the end of the year. And they were published on December 27th and went into effect on December 27th. So we were all internally very happy about that. So, I don't know about you, but one of the problems that I have in doing these PFAS presentations is the jumping around with units. And so and I know you guys don't need this because you do this all the time and you're very familiar with it, so I apologize for putting it up. But for a lot of people, keeping straight the order of milligrams per liter, micrograms per liter, nanograms per liter, parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion, sometimes I think it helps to have it written out. So I'm going to make an effort whenever I do this, particularly to mixed audiences, to have something like this. And let me know if you think this would be useful for people that are looking at it. And I have to admit, as we were finalizing the regs at kind of mid-December, to send them up to the Secretary of State's office, it doesn't help that within the MCP we are not internally consistent as well. And there's nothing I think that terrifies me or probably Liz more than making a decimal point error, a units conversion error at the last minute and not catching it. So. Yes, yeah, that's what I mean. So someday, we may clean all of that up, or let me rephrase that. Someday, somebody else may clean all of that up. But units conversion, and particularly with PFAS, because there are huge differences in levels of concern for drinking water versus other kinds of water, other potential exposures, that you end up with large differences. So it's very convenient to talk about the groundwater one or the RCGW one as being 20 parts per trillion, 20 nanograms per liter. It's a nice number that you can wrap your head around. For RCGW2, the number is much different. And when you put it in terms of 500,000 to 40 million nanograms per liter, God, that sounds really bad. It sounds very large. But it's actually in line with other chemicals and the standards. We just don't talk about them in terms of nanograms per liter. We're always talking about them as milligrams per liter or maybe micrograms per liter. So 3 orders of magnitude, 6 orders of magnitude difference. 6 orders of magnitude difference would be 40 milligrams per liter. Sounds a lot better when you do that. So these slides in our conversations and our talking about the numbers kind of jumps back and forth in units in order to keep the numbers rational and reasonable. But you have to pay attention to the units. So I'm also trying to put units in red or in different. So the RCs, to talk about it specifically, we had years ago, if you remember, when we first started down this road in PFAS, we kind of emphasized that our concerns are primarily exposure to PFAS in drinking water. And a lot of you raised questions about it back before there were RCs and back before the standards and all of that. As we go into it, kind of where the department's focus would be and kind of what the due diligence, particularly in looking back at closed sites. I'm saying you raised these concerns, not me. And one of the things that we kept emphasizing is that our concerns are really directed towards drinking water. And that as far as we know, the potential exposures and thus the risk and thus the level of concern for other types of media are far less. And as we move through this process and now have these standards, I think you're seeing that continued result that in drinking water, the 20 parts per trillion is very, very stringent, very low. But we go where the science is leading us. And for the groundwater 3 values, unless it translates to the RCGW2 here, you'll see that the notification requirements, if it's not in a groundwater 1 area, the notification requirements for finding PFAS are vastly different. And we expect that we will have, based on what we have seen out in the environment these days, that if you're not in a RCGW1 area, then it's unlikely that PFAS in other areas of groundwater will trigger notification. Just my interpretation of that. If you do trigger notification, you're going to be seeing it at levels more consistent with other chemicals that we regulate. In soil, we're going to talk about soil in a little bit more detail a little bit later in this, but for the reportable concentrations, again, you're seeing similar things where RCS1 and the soil numbers are PFAS specific for each of these 6, I'll call them regulated PFAS at the moment, the named PFAS. And the concentrations are 300 to 2,000 nanograms per kilogram. The RCS1 values track the S1 soil standard values. So you see that if you're in the RCS2 area, so these are areas that are distant from a receptor resident schools, but also, I think more importantly, these are areas that are not above GW1 areas. These are above GW1 areas, these are not above GW1 areas. We have more concern here and more stringent numbers. We have less concern here, less stringent numbers. So that's, again, the difference that you're seeing here. It's really the concerns for leaching to groundwater and causing a groundwater problem and having the exposures to drinking water. Okay, into more detail. Groundwater 1, 20 parts per trillion. Does anybody want to hear any more detail about how we got to 20 parts per trillion? or I feel like we talk about that all the time. And the number is what it is. It went through the public comment period. It's based on a reference dose that was modified from the EPA reference dose to further incorporate more toxicity studies, a variety of toxicity studies than were incorporated into the, or considered in developing the EPA reference dose. So that's what gets down to the 20 parts per trillion. It's also for the sum of 6 PFAS that are structurally similar in the 6 to 10 carbon chain length. We had comments on dropping some, adding some, but in the end we stayed with the 6 that we put out for public comment. One of the saving graces for PFAS, I would say, is that it's not volatile, so it's not a GW2 problem. So we have not applicable to that. You take your victories when you can find them with PFAS. And the GW3 standards, and I would put a huge placeholder here that the science is continuing to develop. I believe, and Nancy will correct me if I'm wrong, the GW3 number was based upon a Minnesota surface water value that's there now. It's something that certainly might change in the future as a lot of emphasis is, and a lot of studies on looking at the drinking water type of exposures is probably a lot more work to be done on ecological impacts of PFAS as produced in the environment. And again, someday somebody else will be standing before you, probably talking about changes to the GW3 standard. But this is what we have based on current science right now. So again, vastly different. Milligrams per liter, mean units, to emphasize that it's orders of magnitude different from the GWI. I think just to reinforce what we were seeing and when we came out with standards is consistent, I think, with what we thought we were getting into in the past. So the soil standards, S1, S2, S3, are the soil standards, as you know, are based upon direct contact with soil and consider other factors. There's a slide where we'll go into more detail on this. Right, the actual basis for the numbers that are in the regs are either direct exposure to soil or typical background levels, to the extent that we know it, based upon primarily the Vermont surface soil background study and some work done on the Cape. The standards are PFAS specific, and they range from 300 to 400,000 parts per trillion nanograms per kilogram. Again, the S3s, where you are not above GW1, you're going to be in the 400,000 category. But in areas where you are above the GW1 area, it's driven by the background noise. We can talk about the implications for that in a second. S2, where it's only the direct contact values. It's PFAS specific. It's only on direct contact. It doesn't it doesn't take into account the leaching to groundwater. You do that separately and independently in method 2. And so you see the direct contact values are significantly higher if you rule out concern for leaching. Consistent with that, the upper concentration limits are based on the highest of the method 1 standards, so you have significant levels. I don't expect that we'll be seeing these levels out in the environment. So I don't think we'll be seeing, unless you have a spill of AFFF concentrate, which is possible. It's possible, but barring something like that, I don't think that exceedances of UCLs will be issues. One new thing that's in the regs that went ahead in this group was we were talking about incorporating a section in subpart I for method 3 risk characterizations, which specifies DEP-derived toxicity values. This is an appropriate place to, if we modified or went beyond supplemented, not sure what term I want to use, the US EPA referenced those. So this value is different from EPA's. We feel very strongly that we would like you to use this value, and as a result, we put it in regulations as a requirement for method 3 risk characterization. So what did change from the proposed to the final is the soil numbers. And you may remember that the original soil numbers for any soil S1, S2, S3 above GW1 groundwater incorporated a very conservative leaching component that basically assumed that all of the PFAS in the soil very quickly washes into groundwater and creates a groundwater problem. We did that partly to be conservative. We did that partly because there's a lot of uncertainty in those leaching models. There aren't a lot for these PFAS compounds. We don't have the level of physical constants and default parameters that we do for the more traditional compounds, so it's still a work in progress. So while it was work in progress, we wanted to err on the side of being conservative. One of the things that came out during the public, or just when we went to public comment, where we want background studies that fit in nicely with the way that we develop the method 1 standards, and in the way that we progress with these, the the background values essentially overruled the more conservative, excessively conservative leaching values. I'll say that now, I wouldn't have said that before. The more conservative leaching values, and ended up with higher numbers. And because the background values were based on chemical-specific, PFAS-specific results, we decided to, rather than have a sum, which was sum because we were basing it on leaching, and the leaching number, the GW1 standard is a sum of the 6, we went with individual chemical-specific PFAS numbers for the S1, or for the soil standards, S1 GW1, S2 GW1, S3 GW1. You see that range. This is what I was talking about. This is how we developed the increased soil standards, whether it's S1, S2, S3. We did not calculate a cancer risk-based concentrations. We're evaluating PFAS based on a non-cancer risk that it poses. Sometime in the future, as better or new, different studies come out, we may look at, or would look at, the cancer risk associated with these if a slope factor is developed. But at the moment it's based on cancer risk, non-cancer risk concentration. We come up with a conservative leaching-based concentration, and the ceiling concentration is irrelevant here. So we had proposed the lowest of these 4, which originally was the leaching-based concentration, but even then, we come out with, we then obtained better background information, and also had comments on end-loop detection for the soil, and took those into account. The highest of those were adopted as the method and standards. So we followed the standard process that we've been using since 1993 for balancing the risk pose and concern for leaching with practical considerations like what's out there as background and what can you measure. We had a fact sheet out there, which you guys helped us develop. That was updated December 27th as well, so that it didn't continue to say, oh, we don't have any standards, so we do this instead. In some ways, it's much easier now. It says, we have standards, go forth and use them. But there are other changes as well, talking about the toxicity value and talking about the use of method 2 for this. So you might want to look at that again. Some other considerations that are things you might want to think about, or implications for these. We now have an RCGW1. So in addition to looking at the RCs and deciding whether there's a 120-day notification based on the reportable concentration, there's also this criteria that if it's actually in a private well above the RCGW1, that's a 2-hour notification. If people are drinking it, we want to know about 20 parts per 20. We want to know quickly. So I wanted to point that out as an implication of having the RCGW1. What if you find it in a public water supply above the RCGW1? Ooh, I have a still reported. I have somebody smiling, shaking his head. I have 72 hours. Lisa, it's like, The primary thing is if it's regulated, if it's in a public water supply regulated by our drinking water program, the primary regulation of that is through the drinking water program. And there is notification involved, it's just going through the drinking water program. So we have, in fact, a notification exemption for that type of thing. So we find out about it and we work closely with our drinking water program for this, particularly look back and do source and site discovery, find out where it's coming from. But we want to make sure that the water supplies are primarily working with and answered to the drinking water program. And they have different rules that apply to them, and we'll talk about that in a second. Yes?
Measured in a private well, how is that not a safety or any implications?
Ooh, okay. throw this out. We'll throw this out.
You repeat the question?
Okay, so the question. Oh, actually, no, let's try. The question is, you have this, but isn't this also a CEP, a critical exposure pathway condition that has its own for any measurable amount? And I would say it depends. And what does it depend on? It's kind of somewhat cart before the horse sort of thing. In that if you're going out and you're sampling de novo, so this is the first sample you've taken at this location and you have no other information. You're just sampling your own private well for fun, for instance. And we can help you with that. Unrelated to a release that we know about. Then, and you get 6 parts per trillion of PFAS. Is that identifiable as a critical exposure pathway?
Not for some kind of release that's regulated under.
The CEP and the substantial release migration that goes along with that is related to releases that are already reported. So my response to that, it depends. It depends if it's a site that's already in the system and so there already was an exceedance of a reportable concentration or something else that triggered notification. Then the substantial release migration in CEP would come into effect. But 6 parts per trillion, so less than the RC in a private well where there's nothing else known, it's not in the system, is not itself notifiable. So there will be situations out there, and we're seeing them in sampling data right now, where there are private wells that have low levels of PFAS in them, and that's not very new to the system. But because it might be background, it might be, I don't want to point fingers at anything, but historically for other chemicals, we see impacts from septic systems, for instance. Who knows where it's coming from? But it's different than if you have a site, you have a known release, and you're seeing 200 parts per trillion of PFAS in that well, and 130 parts per trillion of PFAS in that well, and 87 parts per trillion of PFAS in that well, and the one over there is 12, and there's another one that's 6. It's part of a plume. It's not, that would be CEP. It's part of a larger problem, and we want people to deal with the entire problem. And part of the reason we want people to deal with that 6 over there, that's related to the 200 over here, is particularly early on in the process, we don't know where that groundwater is migrating, we don't know how quickly it's migrating, we don't know how quickly that 6 is going to turn into 12, going to turn into 18, going to turn into 25, going to turn into 67. So CEP would, where it's feasible, would require action to reduce that exposure immediately, not wait, not let people continue drinking that water until it reaches a more significant level. Do it now, if it's feasible. So that's why my initial response was it depends. Depends if it's a part of an existing site or not. But this gets you in, definitely. This is something I really want to talk about because I know in talking with other audiences, I don't think they get this a lot. And even internally, it's something I find it's worth explaining kind of what the purposes of the S1 standards are. And in some ways, as we all know, the Method 1 standards are not required in the UCP. They are very helpful. They are very useful for closing out sites where you have levels less than the standards. They're great targets to go for if you need to explain to somebody or give somebody a reason, we need to remove the soil, we need to treat this groundwater, can't do it here, it's very nice and easy. But they're not required, and particularly we have the option of going to a method 2. So the problem that we're really struggling with PFAS in soil is to what extent is it affecting the underlying groundwater? And there's a lot of unknowns here. Leaching models give you generic results. We know that it sticks to soil to a great extent, because we have sites where releases from a decade ago continue to contaminate the groundwater. It doesn't wash immediately into the ground. Perchlorate was like that. Perchlorate didn't stick to the soil. It went pretty quickly to groundwater, and the source was quickly, relatively quickly depleted. We don't see that here, which means that on one hand, the previous leaching values that we went up on the comet were in fact very conservative, because it assumed more quick migration to groundwater. But there's a lot of uncertainty about how much levels in soil will actually affect the underlying groundwater. So if you have soil contaminated with PFAS in the GW1 area, what do you think DEP wants you to do? Look at the groundwater. Particularly given the levels associated with direct contact that are significantly higher, potentially leaching-based concentrations, the easiest way to answer the question of whether this soil is going to adversely impact the groundwater and create a drinking water exposure is to actually look at the groundwater. So that's the way I view these S1 GW1, S2 GW1, S3 GW1 standards. Even now that they're based more on the background levels, it's still, you have measurable levels of PFAS in the soil above background. What next? If you're in a GW1 area, sample the groundwater. And if the groundwater is contaminated above the GW1 level, you have a problem, and you need to deal with it. If the groundwater is not contaminated above GW1, then it's a different story. And as we kind of collect that information, that will help us fine-tune these standards as we go into the future.
And I'll say it so that Jim doesn't have to, but one of the things that comes out of like all the stuff Liz and Jim did is, you may have like a gas station site and you're doing ISCO or something, or ORC or something like that, but all these are transformable compounds, so you have to keep sampling the groundwater because you may be doing remediation, even like ASSB, and transforming, so you may not have been over initially, but your remediation may suddenly increase the concentration.
Yes, the gross simplifications by which I was speaking doesn't negate the complications that apply really to any chemicals.
But specifically to the
and
But just to clarify, in terms of expectations, about PFAS levels in soil, you're only talking about if you're actually in a GW1 area. So just because a soil number is greater than S1 GW1, if you're not in a GW1 area, then like we've already discussed, the groundwater impacts are much lower concern.
correct. If you're not in the GW1 area, then first thing is that the applicable Method 1 standards will be significantly higher. So you will be less likely to be in a situation where you're above the applicable standard and then have to ask what next. So I think that's the first thing. And then second, you would be concerned about whatever potential exposures that would be incorporated into those standards that soil and groundwater category. But drinking water, GW1. So far, that's consistent with what we're seeing for levels. So, and any suggestions for how I can explain how the S1 GW1 standards, or any soil/GW1 standard can be used, and the flexibility and the options on Method 2 to emphasize that our goal is to get people to look at the groundwater where it's GW1, it might be groundwater. And that is far better than not sampling the groundwater and trying to model it in some way. Other consideration, I talked about the reference dose, and that it's a square root of 10 more stringent than EPA reference dose. I just like using the
Also
square root
known
of
as
10.
board. Fish.
And all of that is in a massive technical support document that's linked to various places online. And the other big thing is that the drinking water program is proposing an MCL for PFAS. Coincidentally, 20 parts per trillion for 6. And that's out for public comment. And if you just camp out in this room until tomorrow, then there will be a public hearing here. You can come back. There are other public hearings. There's one going on today. I'm not sure where it is today. Springfield. And then a few more next week as well. Public comment period ends February 28th. I'm very disappointed that they have one chance to close public comment period on February 29th. And they didn't do it. I would have, even though it's a Saturday. But also it's not just the number. These are regulations for the public water suppliers. As you know, there are different categories of public water supplies. They are often regulated in different ways, not the least of which is how frequently they need to look at a particular chemical. So there's a lot going on in these regulations beyond just what the number is. So feel free to comment on any and all of that. And the last thing I would mention is that this does affect the MCP in a couple of ways. First, a drinking water standard would be considered an applicable or suitably analogous requirement. Did I say that right? Yeah, I keep getting, there's a federal ARAR, applicable, relevant, appropriate requirement, and then there's applicable or suitably analogous standards for us. Same thing, that if they have an MCL, even if you're in method 3, you have to meet the MCL. You can't risk it. It's the short answer to that. So that's important. And then the other thing is that we have committed to be consistent within the department. So if through their public comment process, the drinking water program settles on a different number, then the department has committed to revise the MCP GW1 standard to match it. Historically, when we set the standard, the GW1 standard, our first rule is there an existing drinking water standard or guideline? If so, we just adopt it. So we try to be consistent with the drinking water program. And at the risk of creating an endless review, comment, revise cycle that will continue until the end of time, if a different number comes out of the drinking water process, we will change to match that.
Paul, just a question. Is the drinking water program also relying on the ORS information and independent toxicological analysis?
The question is whether the drinking water program is relying upon the ORS references, and these are your words rather than independent toxicological analysis. Sounds very new EPA-ish. We have resident toxicologists here who work with toxicologists and health professionals and advisory committee, much like this, who are not paid by the department. So thus might be considered independent. It's all done through the public process. So it's the same basis of information, the same technical support document. Supports our number and their proposed number. But as we've seen, PFAS has potential for changing very quickly. There are scientific studies that come out every day, and if an important, relevant, strong study comes out next week, then the drinking water program and ORS will want to take that into account on wherever it goes.
I'm just asking from certainly a public water supplier perspective. It makes it very based on, you know, the information that's available now, and then if, you know, someone were to just say, oh, we're adding like 3 more, you know, compounds, or the trickle down implications, it's very, very problematic, especially like I'm saying for public water supplies.
Or a year from now, if you just.
Yeah, and so the observation is that certainly for public water suppliers, the planning for what the state requirements are, and if needed, planning for treatment to cover it, is a long-term process and involves substantial economic commitments and capital expenses. And so I would say we do not, and I think I can speak for the drinking water program as well, that the department does not take changes to these numbers lightly, and we know that there is a value to having consistency and predictability in all of that. So while the impression I want to give is both that there was a lot of effort put into this 20 part per trillion number and getting to that point. It wasn't on a whim. It was carefully thought out, and people at DEP, the toxicologists, the scientists, the managers, the regulators, everybody up the chain, feel very comfortable with the basis of that. We would never rule out changing it based upon really good data. But I think we're not doing it just because a single study comes out that's chosen to make something different. So it's that balance that has to be made. In the drinking water program in particular, it takes into account, because other things beyond strictly risk. As you know, many of the MCLs are not based upon risk, they're based upon technological feasibility, they're based on background, they're based on analytical limits. So they will look at those as well, and they expect comments based upon those. And in my experience in working with them setting the MCLs, perchlorate comes to mind, where there was a risk-based value, and it was modified upward to take into account some of those other factors. So the numbers may change. They will not change lightly if they do change, but we would want to reassure everybody that we would be flexible and open to comments that suggest something different. But as we consider those, we'll also balance the consistency part. So we want to be predictable and flexible.
If the MCL were to change, how long would it take for the GW1 standard to be changed? And what would happen in the interim?
How long would we haven't played out the timing, given a lot of thought to the timing. It could happen in a couple of different ways. One, it could be emergency reg, just to make things consistent, and that might be the easiest way of doing it. It could go through the process, but very, very quickly. The justification for it would be fairly minimal, necessary. There would always be the backstop of kind of the ARR, that there is a public water supply, drinking water standard in Florida. So it would happen. It wouldn't. It took 10 months to go from being proposed last year to it being final. It would be way less than that, even if we just went through the regular process. We had an extended public comment period. If we did it just to make it consistent, we would probably do the minimal public comment period that's allowed, and then at the end result, we probably go into effect very quickly after the comment period ended. It wouldn't be as much deliberation as we saw in the past year. At least I hope. Of course, I hope that my preference would be that 20 parts per trillion continue on, because that would be easiest for me, but that's very personal and very biased opinion and does not represent the department's view. The department is officially open to any comments that might come, and we will follow where it leads. Upcoming activity, this is also PFAS related. We don't want to hear about all the site work that's going on, but we have a number of federal sites that have PFAS, and we're working with EPA, we're working with the Department of Defense. Some of them are affecting drinking water supplies. DOD has been able to transfer some money to some communities to help with that long-term, very expensive treatment systems that need to go in place. There are other facilities where it's not in a drinking water area, not in a GW1 area, but there are concerns for things like NIPT's discharge permits that come up. So there are issues that do come up even outside of GW1 area. There are, yes. And I know nothing about NIPT, so I'm not going to go down that road.
Either, so it's not there. At federal sites and sites where the feds are in GW1 is relevant, what's happening with dispatch between the federal standard and Massachusetts standard if there's
I can tell you why, yes. The question is, at federal sites for GW1 areas, where there is a difference in the way that the federal government looks at PFAS, and we use the word standard, I would use the word health advisory, where they look at PFAS and PFOA, 2, not 6, and they look at 70 parts per trillion, not 20. So there is a difference. I think the important thing to say is that the Department of Defense, the federal government, EPA, they are watching particularly the MCL development process, because at the federal level, a promulgated MCL will be an error at sites, and it makes it very easy for them to point to, the MCL will be a number that is clearly promulgated, it's in regulation, it's enforceable, and it's equitably enforced across the state. And they will be one of a number of PRPs and facilities that will be meeting those standards. So that's kind of the end game, if you will, for all of this. In the meantime, there's a lot of diplomatic discussions going on about what can be said, what can be met, kind of what the process is. But for the most part, I think our relationship with the Department of Defense and the EPA has been very good. And they have their own challenges that I'm not qualified to speak about. But on a site-by-site basis, they're working with the staff, they're working with the sites in New England. It's gone remarkably well. So we have those. The state sites we're finding primarily through the drinking water sampling that has been gone on, and then waste cleanup's role has been to look at from there to find out, one, if private wells are contaminated in the area, and 2, where is it coming from? So that is fun and interesting, if time-consuming. And to kind of make it even more challenging, there was a supplemental budget that passed at the end of December, which allocated $4.2 million for sampling of private and public water supply wells. Actually, I'm going to reverse that. Public water supply wells and private wells. The public comes first. So there is talk of additional funding that would bring it up to about $8.4 million. The 4.2 was half of what was originally proposed. So we may have more money available for that. Given those values, it looks like the state will be able to fund at least one round of testing for PFAS for every public water supply in the state. In addition, depending upon how the process works, and there are a lot of variables in this, we may be able to sample between, don't hold me to these numbers, but roughly 1,500 to 2,500, maybe 3,000 private water supply wells. That's a lot. A couple things need to happen before before that happens. One is having some logistical support. We're working towards getting that done. It can't just fall on DEP staff to do it. And the extent of how far that money will go will depend on how much we need to get people to go out and actually do the sampling versus the well owners or the water suppliers doing the sampling themselves. Contractor costs for doing the work will be, it directly comes out of the amount for the actual sampling. So that has to be worked out. We have to work out a process for how we identify the private well owners. We know who the public water supply wells are. The private well owners, we have, what we would like to do is have some of those samples be more of a, random is probably not the word, but well-distributed sampling. So it gives us a good idea of just what's out there, unrelated to sources. A lot of the sampling we're doing now is working out from known contamination. So it's not representative of what the baseline conditions are across the state. This is a great chance for us to get that information. To sample not based on a known source or a likely source, but just what's out there. So we're working out the ways of doing that. And we also do want to target locations based on proximity to some suspect sources as well, so that we have a better sense of how much certain types of sources might contribute to PFAS contamination in the general environment. So it's a big project. We have until June of 2021 to get it done so far.
So that's just money that for DEP to spend. It's not money for DEP to allocate and distribute to public water suppliers?
The question was, that's money for DEP to spend, not for us to distribute to public water suppliers. Correct. But what it means is we'll, for example, recently we recently got access to that money, and while we haven't set up the more formal program, there are public water supplies that, for one reason or another, need to sample. We would like them to sample now. We've been encouraging the larger public water supplies to step forward so that we can quickly cover a large percentage, be able to say that 60% of the state citizens have known, we've sampled their water and we know what's in it. So we're targeting at first the large public water supplies. So we have a mechanism in place where we can pay for the sampling, and whether they do the sampling, whether we do the sampling, it's the lab, we'll pay for it. So we're working on that. So we don't have to give them the money to do the sampling. We'll pay the lab. They can send the samples to the lab and we'll pay for it.
Like follow-up, so it's not just site discovery, it's not to supplement municipal costs for if they have to test private wells beyond detection of their own public well. You're not supplementing their funding. It's not a support. It's not a program to support the expenses being incurred by municipalities.
It is not a program to support municipalities sampling private wells. It gets very complicated. That the only case where we would ask municipalities to sample private wells are in the case where a municipality is a potentially responsible party. And this money is not to support PRP's sampling. In cases where a public water supply, and say for instance municipal owned public water supply, has elevated levels of PFAS, the department, through wayside cleanup and in our site discovery program, has been doing the private well sampling. It's only in cases where we have reason to believe the town or the city is a PRP that we would ask them to do. In the absence of a PRP, we've been doing the site discovery work. And sometimes that leads to finding the PRP, and we ask them to take it over. Sometimes that might be the town. for a variety of reasons. But this money is not for actual site work. It is really, you should think of it as money to get a handle on what's, the baseline conditions today or this year.
Putting on my other hat, my Board of Health hat, I think it would be great if, in terms of identifying private wells for sampling, local boards of health can be a great resource for DEP to reach out to help, select maybe some good spatial representation in towns that rely from private water. My town does pretty much exclusively. And also, it's really good information for the local municipalities to have as well. So in the past, sometimes communication between DEP and municipalities hasn't been great. So I think I'm just suggesting that might be, or late, or So I just think it would be a really easy way to help DEP as well identify.
Yeah, couple things in there. One is that yes, we recognize that the local boards of health would be very helpful in doing this, and our plans do include working with the boards of health. Another, in the communication aspect, we have our IT folks, particularly the guys behind this wall. They're working on a project to be able to take the data in as we get it from the labs and be posted fairly quickly online. So the transparency of this is very important. I've been very impressed, as we bring people up the line all the way up to the governor's office. The Baker administration has been very emphatic that they want proactive sampling and they want the information to be readily available and transparent. And that has been very helpful, both in getting the funding and giving us kind of the means to get it done. There's one other thing I was going to say. Yeah, one aspect of that is that we need to be careful, particularly private well sampling, is protecting homeowners, addresses, names, and things like that. So that we are looking at various ways. So all of which to say, these are reasons why we haven't jumped in with 2 feet. The day that the supplemental budget was signed, there's a lot of thought that has to go into it, and not the smallest problem being lab capacity. Any free space there? Any slots we can fill? And part of that is we have an RFP out on the street. I don't know if it's closed already, but the drinking water program. Wayside Cleanup has access to labs through a standing contract that we use, and we're actually using that mechanism right now for some of the public water supply sampling we funded out of supplemental budget. But the longer term approach would be for the drinking water program to have a similar sort of lab contract with a larger number of labs that can do this work, so that the potential for a lab capacity bottleneck will be diminished. But that's one of the things that has to be kind of closely avoided. So it sounds great. Oh, here's 4.2 million. Go out and sample. And when you look into it, it's very interesting. It's a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of work, and it's far more complicated than it initially sounds.
Is it led by Wayside, or is it being led by water?
It is going to be led primarily by water supply. That is my fervent hope. Partly because if they find something, if we find something, if the department finds something in the sampler, what will fall to Wayside Cleanup is the question. Now what? And I think we're going to have our hands full with that. Yeah, that's big. So, and that will be our problem, and that's kind of working out, kind of being upfront with the private well owner, kind of what the potential outcomes will be, what the state can step up and do, what we expect them to do, possibly. So there's a lot to work out before it actually happens. But exciting times ahead. All right, any other questions? Yes?
I have a question, I don't know if it's for now or later, about the practicality or technical issues surrounding summing PFAS and six compounds. Should I wait on that question or again? It has to do with, there isn't good guidance on how to handle non-detects in a sum. There's also not good guidance, personally I use professional judgment on how to handle or assess blank contamination. If you have blank data, method blank or field blank, and how do you assess that, how do you handle that with your field data? You gauge the data at a certain level, qualify it as high. So if you look at the sum of six compounds, you can, if you think about it, have very low level detects that are consistent with either background or contamination that would sum to over 20. If you don't handle it appropriately and evaluate your QA/QC points. So I have some questions about how that's going to practically be done, or is there going to be guidance coming out of the department on that?
That is exactly what I was thinking about when I put in et cetera. That in the drinking water reg proposal that's out there, one of the issues that they're seeking public comment on is how to manage result. And the bottom line is if you have what you might think of as J values, indication that the compound is there, is present, but you can't quantify it. But it's there. So how to deal with that? In the MCP world, looking at our regulations, we do, and I carefully use the word measured in some of this, we do look at and specify measured levels, measured values in that, which we take to mean above quantifiable levels. And that applies to CEP, that would apply to this as well. So absent any other requirements, that's what our regulations say. The drinking water program is considering, partly because of the summing issue, it has become less of a problem now that I think that or less of an issue now that this is my personal opinion, that the quantitation limits are lower, but we could have situations where one of these six PFAS compounds are present, but below quantitation levels. You know it's there, but you can't quantify how much. So there are options for how to deal with that. One is to treat it as a non-detect. Another is to treat it, assign its value at the quantitation level. Another is to give it half the quantitation level. How do you account for something you know is there, but you're not really confident about what the level is? And ignoring it is one extreme. Saying it's there at the quantitation level is another, and it's in between. So what the drinking water program has proposed is that in between of, if it's between the method detection limit and the quantitation limit, and hopefully I'm getting the words right. If it's in that gray zone where you know it's there but you can't quantify it, then to assign half the quantitation limit. That is out for public comment. We will read the public comment and take it into account. And it's an opportunity, rather than us telling, right, we wouldn't provide guidance on how to do it until the end of that public comment period and see what comes out.
And DEP would, and under your reasoning, DEP would adopt the same.
Certainly if it's for an MCL. Comparison to the MCL, whenever you have an existing standard as an error, if their regulations say this is how you create a number that you compare to the MCL, then that's how you do it. Oh, yeah.
So Steve LaRosa has this, and now a metaphor of, you know, designing the plane, building the plane while flying on the plane over the ocean. So which I thought was good. And the MCL is great because we have, it's an MCL and you have a EPA drinking water method. But for your groundwater and your soil S1 GW1, we don't have any CAM methods. As far as I know, we don't have any EPA methods. So, you know, and not saying we're putting the cart before the horse, but I mean, it does give us somewhat of an additional problem in the whole data world, right? I mean, or have I missed something? Did there suddenly last night or this morning come out of?
No, but there will be methods. I mean, there are methods out there. You know, right now it's use the best available.
Well, I mean, I'm saying, you know, like Jim and others say, I mean, every lab is developed trying to scramble and come up with some kind of modification, which EPA is about drinking water methods. But you know, did that come into the department's discussion at all? The fact that we're setting standards for things for which there are no analytical methods, and especially no CAM methods for something that we're supposed to be using CAM.
To clarify, there are analytical methods. There are no EPA certified, recognized, whatever word you want to use there, analytical methods. But there are analytical methods. For instance, and yes, we did get some comments on that. Interesting, we got comments from, you know, and this happened several times, so I'm not picking on any particular person, but a set of comments saying that, you know, your S1 GWR number is too low. You should consider background. Vermont has this great background study. It has really good data. You should use that. Same comments, paragraph later. There are no soil methods. You can't have a standard for soil. Do you see the difference in that? Yeah. So there are methods out there. You know, when EPA had it, everything will be better when EPA has soil methods and they're coming with them. When we have a CAM method and we want to have a CAM method for it. But we were not going to hold up, you know, having a standard in regulating it until then.
No, I understand that, and the MCP has provisions for how to deal with things for which there are not CAM methods, and we have to find analogous, suitable quality control, AQC, etc. I'm just saying, you know, people need to be aware that that's going to be an additional burden in trying to demonstrate, for example, that hey, we don't have.
Right. Jim, you might have an opinion on it.
Not on that, but I wanted to point out that the current water program form has on it 1/3 the RL as something that we're supposed to. That's the zone, 1/3 the RL, and that number labs do not. We don't store that in the database. We're not looking for 1/3, so it becomes a manual exercise to try to like do those forms. I would suggest looking at that.
Thank you. I think it would be helpful to have a nice written comment.
This may be a segue to your next topic, but given that PFAS seems to be a concern with drinking water in GW1, do you see PFAS criteria creeping into Club 97?
I saw that, yeah. As well, stripping.
Good question. Without committing to, you know, specifically Club 97 or Comp 15, yes, there will be more detail about kind of what to do with PFAS contaminated soil. We're already dealing with that and have some discussions on that. And I would throw out there, for instance, in the short term, that what would really be helpful would be reclamation soil facilities that are in RCS2 areas. Go back and look at numbers. Again, emphasizing that our primary concern is with GW1, even when we're looking at soil, our primary concern is how is that soil acting as a source to underlying GW1. So if you're talking about areas that are not in a GW1 area, then things become a lot more flexible and a lot easier to deal with, and that includes ways of managing soil. But for any particular facility, I would point out that it will still be up to them, and I think there's a lot of anxiety out there about PFAS in general, and we see that with, say, landfills as well. Just it's an unknown.
Right, here, of course, they're saying, landfills are just saying, no, back.
So-
So I want to cover a couple of things. First, I think, is he still here? Brian? Okay, I'll come back to Brian. I was going to say, in our confusion, we forgot to recognize that Brian Moran was here from taking over for Marty Hilfinger's position with Nexema. When Brian comes back, I'll ask him to say what Nexema means, because I can never remember that. Another practical matter with respect to the PFAS changes that I want to point out, how many people still have a hard copy of the MCP that they got? Wow, old school. So the PFAS pages, there are replacement pages published by the Secretary of State. This has happened before. What happened this time around, and which is that with the tables in particular, there are some shading that was left behind in some of the tables, which makes it illegible if you purchase this. So we are in order to get that changed and to have them republish those pages, we actually have to file a notice of correction. So I didn't want people to get alarmed when they saw us, filing a notice of correction in the Mass Register. We didn't find any other errors in terms of what was published, but we are going to get these changes, these pages redone. So if you haven't gone ahead and purchased them, I would hold off. I think it's probably be a couple of weeks before that gets republished. Unrelated to PFAS and the rest of the MCP changes, I want to highlight that in December we posted updates to the EPH method and the EPH CAM protocol. And at that point we sent out a notice to the labs to let them know it was there. The changes go into effect on March 1st, and I will send out a notice through BWSC information, and also I think I'll ask the LSTA if they would also post that separately as one of your, what do you call those, highlight. The most significant change to the method, I think, is a change in the holding time for soil samples and sediment samples that are frozen from 48 hours to 24 hours. And the rest of the list of the revisions and clarifications you'll find on the third page of the method. So they're bulleted points of what's been updated. So look for that email, and we'll have links to the updated method and CAM protocol. And Brian, while you're out of the room, I mentioned that you had taken over for Marty's spot, and I was going to welcome. And I was gonna ask you to say what NEXIMA stands for. Welcome to the big table.
Does it bring back memories?
So before Nancy gets going, Nancy's going to focus on a continuation of the discussions we were having on the risk characterization provisions and changes to the exposure point concentration and the waste provisions that we talked about at the stakeholder meeting in November. I just wanted to mention where we are on the rest of the package and ask you all to reserve the next advisory committee rolling date as a confirmed meeting. We want at that meeting to go over any additional changes we're proposing from proposed to finals that we think are significant. Give you a last chance to weigh in on this. So we'll be covering that at that meeting. And if time allows, we may also do an update on the standard natural resource damage methods as well. Where we hope to be on the schedule is to be working to complete the revisions to the rest of the package over the next, throughout February, to the end of February, and then move it on to our DEP internal review in March. So that would include also sending it back to wayside cleanup staff, Office of General Counsel, up through the Commissioner's office. And then once we clear the building, then it goes through that, up to the Secretary's office and administration and finance before we can publish it.
So does that mean that our last chance to make any comments would be at this meeting, or given that process, because then you said it's internal?
Yes, I think primarily. I mean, I think we want to highlight anything that we think we've adjusted from what was proposed that seems significant. And so,
will we get a copy of that before the next meeting, because that would be, a lot of sections.
we're not proposing to put the actual text out for comment because.
But what changes you're adopting, or what?
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, I am going to be out of the country, and I have a vested interest in some of the other sections.
Mhm.
And how would I comment on whether you agree or disagree with my company's comments? You know what I'm saying? If I don't get a preview, like where would I comment?
Well, we are going to be addressing each of the comments that we received in a response to comment document. But many of those, we're going to take the comment, weigh them, and make a decision, and we're not proposing to bring all of that back for additional discussion. And so I was thinking that in February, we really reserved that for, here are some things where we made a significant change from what we had proposed based on the comment, and highlighting that. And how we select those topics, I understand there's a lot of judgment in our selecting those and what we bring back to you. And
Or are you not requesting input, you're just
Displaying.
So I guess that's the question. Yeah. So for example, when we had PFAS discussion this morning, we made some input.
right.
I mean, whether or not it goes anywhere, that's okay, but we made some input, we had some significant comments that came out of that discussion. Or clarification.
Well, I could see that we could put some detail into the agenda for the meeting, and typically we get those out, just before the meeting, a week before. we could, try to get that out 2 weeks before the meeting, if that seems helpful.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
So we could just, look at it and see if we want to.
Okay. All right, so, so I just want to highlight that date and that plan, and Nancy? Wait, Nancy. Would you prefer this
Can everybody hear me with this microphone that I'm using right now? It's like, yes. Okay, thank you for coming, thank you for your patience in this process. As Liz said, we're continuing to focus on two areas where we see a lot of comments. Exposure point concentration provisions and waste-related provisions. And as I go through those two topics, I'll take the EPCs first, and when I'm going through them both, I will first do a quick review of the comments that you put in. You've seen them before, and then highlight some of the areas where we agree that there should be changes made, and then go on to talk a little bit about more specifically what we plan to do, although I'll be speaking in concept, not in detail. You won't be seeing regular project here or anything like that.
Nancy, are you considering comments put forth at the worker meeting as well as?
At the state, we were calling it a state
Oh,
meeting on November 14th,
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to reflect a little bit on where we've been and where we are. We proposed revisions in the spring, public comments were due in the summer. We had internal policy discussions, then stakeholder meeting in November, on the 14th of November. That was followed by more internal policy discussions, and we're now developing a final revision plan, and that's what I really want to bring to you today. In planning final revisions, our goals are to incorporate the recommendations that you've all made to the extent possible, but still revise language in a way that still achieves the course corrections that we originally intended to make. So first I'll talk about soil EPCs. Some of the comments you've made were, better explanation of the little phrase we had about data size justification, that we should consider grandfathering all sites, move sampling related provisions to subpart H earlier in the regs, offer additional alternatives to the 98% UCL as an EPC, and eliminate the size, with regard to where we had differentiated between complex sites and simple sites, and differentiated between the sampling and calculation requirements for those two categories. People thought we should eliminate the size criterion, allow more flexibility and professional judgment, describe situations where more rigorous requirements should apply, and not just describe where they don't have to apply and say, well, all the other sites they have to apply. People want a more specific description of the characteristics of sites that require more rigorous review. Some of the points of concurrence, I'll just go through quickly. The discussion of data set size, we agreed that it was not placed in a very good context anyway, so we're putting it in a more appropriate context, linking it more to existing regulations and trying to make it more clear that it wasn't meant to be a brand new requirement, something different. It's just part of the process. The size criteria for identifying where and whether the sampling would be required, we're losing that. That's one thing I'll say for sure. Provisions for alternative UCLs, people said, well, normal distribution UCL, maps and so forth. We just sort of simplified that language. And then to kind of open it up more. And the sampling approach, we agreed should be discussed earlier in the sections of the MCP, although it's a little bit different than what was suggested. It is going to come up earlier. And adding the characteristics of sites that require more rigorous sampling and not just talk about the characteristics of sites that don't require sampling. So I'm going to talk a little bit in concept about our plans. And I just want to emphasize that this is very conceptual, it's not regular language. So it's, don't quote this for anything, but so anyway, here we go. As I said, we do plan to eliminate the size criteria to 2,000 square feet for sites that call for a more conservative estimate. We plan to link the sampling approach more closely to the conceptual site model and other requirements for site investigation, and to the known or expected nature of contamination. And we plan to reference existing sections of the MCP and calling for technical justification for the size of the data set. So you recall that originally we had put in the exposure point concentration section requirements about sampling, different requirements distinguished between two different sites, complex and simple. It's a very rigid distinction. And we put different requirements for sampling, the sampling approach for both of those, and also for the exposure point concentration requirements for both of those, where judgmental sampling in simple sites you can use averaging, but more complex sites you can use systematic sampling and upper complex sampling. So we've taken the sampling parts of that out and moved them to an earlier part of the regs, but moved them to mainly to 40.0904. So it's more tied in with other requirements in the discussion about what's required in the report. And so we've again said that judgmental sampling is basically the criteria will be that it was used from a known discrete source, it's limited to a well-defined area, pretty much the same as before. And distributed so that these are sites where we would expect the contamination to be distributed in a predictable pattern consistent with a discrete case. And then on the other hand, we're describing where systematic approach is required, systematic sampling approach is required, where the contamination is not from a discrete source and the concentrations are not expected to be distributed in a pattern that's consistent with that. And these are sites where you're likely to see highly variable concentrations, even over small area scales of area. So we've taken that up and moved that out, and then in 40.0926 we simply link the requirements for how to calculate the concentrations back to whether you use judgmental sampling or whether you use systematic sampling. So where judgmental sampling is appropriate, still use the average and use the existing requirements in the MCP and average in certain conditions. Where systematic sampling has been used, then you would use a 90% upper confidence limit, 90% non-parametric upper confidence limit, or the alternative would be a technical justification for an alternative. So we're not giving examples or citing any specific alternatives here, and we anticipate addressing these alternatives in guidance and not putting that level of detail in regulations.
One quick question. So the one place where I see some of this jumping out at me as something to think about is in cases where if there's a filled source, and you typically see very heterogeneous distributions over the fill area. So predictable is kind of a funky word. I would say, it's consistent with the pattern, maybe not process to me is more urgent than ever for DEP to work on finalizing the bill policy, because all of this EPC stuff, if you can, have confidence that your contaminants are related to the placement of fill and can meet the key criteria, I think, some of the sites that maybe are getting mixed and matched and being sucked into like maybe a systematic approach like this might not have to deal with it in a risk assessment context. If you can have the confidence that you can eliminate it from that adventure using a data cycle. So I'm not being critical of that, but I'm just saying this really begs that really.
Point taken. Are we writing that down? As I said earlier, people really thought that all this discussion about sampling and maybe in some of the EPC sections should be moved up into subpart H, where it really discusses the basics of site assessment requirements. But when you look at subpart H, the level of detail there is very low, and it really didn't accommodate moving this material into that. At least we didn't feel like it did. So we are not moving this material into that section, but simply including a cross-reference in that section up to the sections of 40.09, where sampling requirements are discussed. So that's it for exposure point concentrations. For what I plan to say, does anybody have any questions on that section? Yes.
More generally, in November, we talked about your thoughts about indoor air and sediment surface water. Is what you were thinking back then holding true now? In regards to averaging versus UCLs for air, I think you mentioned sediment and surface water. You might also lean towards averaging as opposed to UCL because of complexity of the sampling.
Yes. Someone else is working on the air part, so I'm not addressing that. And there were comments about being specifically allowing averages for groundwater that's not in GW1 basically, and that will be incorporated as well.
And
sediment surface water.
Sediment, I think, yeah. Sediment, I think we've lumped with soil at this point. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be always a good fit. Sediment is really complicated and difficult to sample. So,
Not usually.
I'm sorry, the specific comment that you were asking if we addressed was whether you could do averages for sediments, is that as opposed to UCL?
Yeah,
Because there were comments that said, include this in UCL, include sediment in UCLs, that sediment should be treated the same way statistically as soil.
In November, I think I remember you saying that you were leaning towards sticking with averaging for those media. And I just wanted to confirm if that's still your thinking or if things have changed.
Basically, although I think we were trying to respond to people were saying, well, this is a lot like soil, but I'm gonna look back at that and not say any more about it, but because I take your point, that's sediment. You can't treat it exactly like soil all the time. Physically, it's just not possible. So, okay, moving on to assessing waste deposits. Some of the comments that we had were that areas of waste disposal should be better defined. Types of waste that we meant to cover should be clarified. Defining waste deposits as hotspots. Calls for a size criterion, so we should have sort of a size limit on that. We need to eliminate hotspots and small spots and thin layers from that hotspot provision. Comparing waste concentrations to UCLs presents analytical challenges and might result also, we expect it to result in more engineered barriers, and people didn't think that was necessarily appropriate. So as far as areas of concurrence, the types of waste included, we agree were not clearly defined. the proposed broad category that we had in the original proposal, really included waste that would be best assigned much more differently from each other, differently from coal tar certainly. And the proposal to identify waste deposits as hotspots did raise questions about delineation, and also overall the proposal implied the need for that you have to do chemical analysis of waste when you encounter it. And so we agree that those are problems, and our plan is to, first of all, focus the provisions on coal tar. It's no longer just waste deposits, it's coal tar. Because that's what's really different and really can be problematic. We are eliminating the designation of waste deposits as hotspots. We're eliminating that, and eliminating the comparison of waste constituents to UCL. And for direct contact, kind of in place of that, in part, for direct contact with waste, we're requiring that the EPC be based on the known or estimated oil or hazardous material in the coal tar itself. Now, the estimated part here I think is really important, because what that means is if you have a coal tar site, we don't want to force you to take a coal tar sample, because if you're going to try to analyze coal tar, you're either going to wreck a GC or dilute out so many of the constituents that it wouldn't represent the risk anymore. So I see that as really problematic. So the estimated part is important because it allows us to qualitatively assess the risk of coal tar, and to just go into the literature. We know what's in coal tar. We know how bad it is. We don't need to reckon with GCs to prove that. And then also, kind of in place of the UCL, or I'm sorry, the upper concentration limit provisions that we had related to waste. We've taken waste out of that, and we just defined the presence of waste. We want to just define the presence of waste, of coal tar, as a risk of harm to welfare and the environment. Just define it as that, as a risk of harm, coal tar and the environment. I apologize, to welfare and environment. I realize it's really late, so I'm trying to go really fast, and that's not working. I apologize. To do that, what we're doing is trying to create a separate coal tar subsection, 40.0994, to first of all connect significant risk of coal tar with accessibility, and we're bringing in those accessibility categories from earlier in the regulations to define the accessibility of coal tar, and we're defining the risk of coal tar connected with that accessibility. We are, though, retaining the preference for engineered barriers for coal tar. This is a preference that is coming from your wayside cleanup managers, regional managers. We've had a couple of discussions on this, and people really do feel like there should be a preference for engineered barriers for permanent solutions. If you're going to take a permanent solution, it really needs to be an engineered barrier and not just an AEL or a CAP for accessible coal tar. So that is being retained. And oops, there we go. With that, I'm done. Does anybody have any questions on these questions? Yes.
Two quick questions. One is, when you say define the presence of coal tar, are you going to have a de minimis threshold, or for example, for reporting things like apple thickness, is there going to be any kind of threshold, or you literally a small, a globule almost of coal tar?
Well, the discussions that we've had in the Bureau really have led to an answer of no on that. And the idea is that if you just have a blob of coal tar, it's easy to remove that. If you just have a small amount of coal tar, it's easy to remove it. So at the point where it's not small enough to remove, that if it's accessible, we still not concerned about that.
Right.
So
Right. But I guess actually, a lot of sites, well, these sites, the coal tar can be located at greater than 15 feet. So, for the harm to welfare and the environment, there's not that issue. So you could have coal tar at 20 feet below ground surface, so you're not concerned about eco-receptor people, but you're still wrapped in because of this. So, so when you're saying it's easy to remove, well, not necessarily, because it could be located at great depths.
Well, our thought was that by attaching risk to those accessibility categories, that would take care of that problem.
But harm to welfare and the environment, you're saying you're defining presence, there's no, depth trigger.
In that section, there will be an the accessibility criteria are still in there, it's not, the accessibility definitions that go with S1, S2, S3 are still in there, so that should eliminate it.
But harm to welfare and the environment never had a depth.
No, but we're putting it in the section
So
for
you're
coal tar,
adding-
so we're adding it.
Okay,
to the section for coal tar.
okay, so are we never gonna run into the situation where you have some coal tar greater than 15 feet, so you don't technically need an engineered barrier, but rather some kind of notice or, something with you recording knowing that's
That's the thought.
present?
Yep. So that's a wrap.
Anything else before we wrap up? You're all free to
Any idea what happened there earlier?